If you were raised in the West, you probably take for granted that you are living in the world's dominant culture. But why did the West come out on top? Was it technology? Not likely. East Asia and Europe were on par with each other up into the 18th century. And it certainly wasn't genetic, because the biological differences between different peoples around the world are so minute that they don't matter. A popular thesis to explain this phenomena is that of ecologist Jared Diamond in Gun, Germs, and Steel, which theorizes that geographic distribution of animal resources determined that a world-dominating culture would come out of the Eastern Hemisphere. There is much to this theory, but it doesn't explain why the world-dominating culture came out of Europe instead of East Asia. To understand this, we are going to need an additional explanation. One possible answer to this comes from Scottish economic historian Niall Ferguson and his work, Civilization. Many people portray these works as being opposites, but I have found them to actually be more complementary. If Diamond's work explains why a world-dominating culture was going to come out of Eurasia, then Ferguson's work explains why it comes out of Western Eurasia instead of Eastern. There are multiple videos out there explaining Diamond's thesis, one of which you can find a link to by clicking the eye in the upper right corner. But let me explain Ferguson's side of the synthesis and explore how the West conquered the rest. When you look at a map of Europe, what do you see? A bunch of similarly sized countries with a couple outliers. Now, what do you see when you look at a map of East Asia? One giant country surrounded by a bunch of smaller countries. These modern maps reflect the nature of these two regions' histories. European history is a story of a bunch of medium-sized powers in a near constant state of war and balance. East Asia is the reverse. It's a history of China dominating and dictating terms to its neighbors. This competition has forced European governments to evolve and adapt because if they didn't, they'd face extinction. China, on the other hand, has more or less existed within its current borders for over 2,000 years. No neighboring country has the manpower to conquer it, and China itself is at the limits of its state's ability to control territory. Not only did European states have to compete with other European states, they also had to compete with religious institutions. In Europe, Christianity developed the idea of theological orthodoxy, meaning that there is an official interpretation of religious texts and an officially adopted set of religious texts. When these institutions have a near monopoly on religious practices of an area, they have a lot of power. Because of this, the Christian Church served as an additional challenger to European governments from within their own borders. And after the Reformation, the West had to face internal spiritual competition, which eventually led to a reduction in internal sectarian violence. East Asian religions, on the other hand, never developed this idea of theological orthodoxy, or at least not to the same extent or the same way as Europe did. The lack of orthodoxy for East Asian religions resulted in religious institutions being far weaker than their European counterparts. The Chinese state was rarely, if ever, in conflict with religious institutions. So on top of little to no competition from other East Asian states, there was little competition for power between the state and other institutions. It's a very capitalist interpretation, but competition between states and entities has historically led to improvement in everything. And competition is much easier to foster when you have For most of history, land was either owned collectively by the state or held by force of arms. The development of state-recognized private property became a boom for the culture that developed it. In the late Middle Ages, most land in Europe was owned by the crowns, held in trust for the people collectively. Much of these lands became known as the commons. It was a terribly inefficient way to manage land, resulting in much of it becoming useless. Watch my video about the tragedy of the commons to get a more detailed explanation. Bottom line is, with the land held in common, there is little to no innovation in terms of farming and industry. When the land began to be privatized, individual owners began to experiment with new farming techniques, which sparked an agricultural revolution, which led to more food being produced, thereby allowing population growth. When common lands became privatized, those private lands became enclosed by fences. This resulted in people who used to make a living on those lands moving to the cities, which provided a labor force for budding manufacturing, upon which the modern world is built. The United States took the idea of individual land ownership and made it a part of their expansion. Thanks to disease and other unfortunate occurrences, the New World was pretty empty compared to Europe or Asia. This left a lot of land open and unused, which many enterprising Westerners jumped on the opportunity to get, knowing that they would never be able to own land in Europe. In the early years of the US, the federal government had a policy of selling land it owned, often at a loss, in order to encourage economic independence and growth out west. The parts of the world where land was held in private hands grew wealthier, and as history shows, when people are wealthier, they demand more political rights. At this point in time, there seems to be a correlation between the wealth of a country and the wider distribution of political power. There are exceptions, but this pattern seems to be the norm. And this pattern follows private land ownership. There are many attempted explanations for why the West became dominant, and this is just a taste of the thesis provided by Neil Ferguson in Civilization, the West and the Rest. However, throughout this whole video, I never took the time to define what exactly it means to be Western. To get the answer to that question, you should check out this video from Cogito, whom I made this video in tandem with. So go ahead and watch his video and subscribe to his channel. You won't regret it. Thanks for watching.